Hi guys, this is Double2 for PokerStrategy.com for one more video of my series 10 tips to get out of the micros. This time I'm gonna approach a topic that I called attack checks, and what I mean by this is that we should be trying to stab at pots that no one wants, I guess, that the PFR is not very interested in. And yeah, a lot of situations where there's a lot of dead money in the pot, and they are very common situations, and so it's a good. I think it's a good topic for increasing your win rate, since they are quite common spots, and you're going to understand what I mean by that. So let's start. Okay, sorry. So let's say button min raises on the button. We don't have a lot of info on him. He looks like a regular. So hero calls with our wide range against the min raise on the big line. And we see this flop, okay, and we check like 100% of the time, and villains check behind, and we see this turn. Okay, so what do I think about this type of spots? Okay, I think my main points here, first of all, we should be value betting thinly. So I definitely think we should be betting all of our top pairs, even the ones with a weak kicker. So if I have here a hand like, let's say 10-7 suited, I think we should be betting that. And we should be betting close to 3/4 spot. And most second pairs we should be value betting / protection betting. So a hand like ace-6 suited, I think it's a good bet. Even king-6 suited, queen-6 suited, there's still some value in it. So I definitely think we should be betting, and of course pocket sevens, pocket eights, pocket nines if we have that. But my main point is we should be bluffing a bunch, and I think that a lot of you guys are not playing this spot aggressive enough. I think a lot of you are check folding hands here, hands like, I don't know, like queen 8 of clubs or king 9 or stuff like that. And I don't think you should do that at all. I think, especially at these stakes, when the button checks back this flop, he's giving up a fair amount, and you have to remind yourself that when you bet here 3/4 spot, it only has to work like 50% of the time, a bit less than that. So it's not like if villain continues 1/3 of the time, we are still making money by bluffing that. And of course, a lot of our hands still have equity. Like if we bet here on the turn with king 9 and villain calls with, I don't know, ace-6 or pocket sevens, we definitely have some outs, and we definitely can improve. And yeah, that should mean that we need less fold equity on the turn, since we have equity when we don't get a fold. So I wrote here, yeah, bluff every gut shot, or better, of course. And I say bluff every overcard to the 10. I think that's good. Like bluff every king, every queen, every jack. I think it's good. And yeah, cards below the 10 are pretty much either have a gut shot or a pair. So yeah, we're not check folding much here. And then I mentioned here protection bets. Let's take a hand like ace deuce suited. It intuitively it doesn't feel like a good bet, right? Because it's not a very good value bet, because it's hard to be ahead when villain calls, although it might be possible, but it's very thin, to say the least. And it's of course not a good bluff bet, because villain is not folding a better hand, that's for sure. So, but I still think that betting with a hand like ace deuce of hearts should be the most plus EV decision here, just because I don't think button is bluffing enough when we check. And what ends up happening is that when we check, he checks back a lot of hands that he's giving up with, and you already know what I'm gonna say next, since he's every holding that he's checking back has at least an average of 6 outs to beat our ace deuce, right? If we check ace deuce and he checks back with king 8, he still has 6 outs to improve and beat our hand. So what ends up happening is that when we check, we just give up a lot of free equity to a super wide range that villain opens up from the button. So I definitely think betting every pair here should be good, at least at these stakes. And it should be the most profitable approach, in my opinion, at least. So, yeah, this is my reasoning. So villains will not defend enough of their checkbacks on the flop. Most of them are just giving up. Are not they don't have a very good game plan on the flop, so they check a lot to give up. And a button's range have of course they have a very wide range that has equity and it's giving up, so it's very good for us to bluff out that equity. And of course they almost never have strong hands, so putting pressure on that range is pretty cool. Okay, so now you might not have realized this, but I'm gonna point it out to you. So now we see a slight different situation. So I replaced the 10 with an ace. So the pre-flop action is the same, the flop action is the same. Flop goes check check, and then we face this turn, but now the board is this one. So this is a bit different because now we cannot really value bet thinly. So I mean, we can value bet thinly, of course. We can bet every top pair, that's true. But now, a lot of our value hands are worse, of course. Now it's a lot more thin to value bet a hand like pocket sevens and pocket eights, just because I think villains will have a decent amount of weak ace X when they check back this flop. I do think there is some tendency to do that. Like if villain has a hand like ace 3 on the flop, or ace 5, or ace 7, or even ace 9, I think they check back a bit too much. So I do think that on this turn, villain's range has a bit too much top pair hands for us to be bluffing a lot. So what I could say, and of course we don't have over, so our bluffs don't have that much equity. So on the previous example with the 10, if we bluff a hand like king jack or queen 9 or whatever, against villain's calling range, we would still have like 3, 4, 5, 6 outs. In this case, it's a lot more close. It's a lot more tougher because if we bluff here king 9 or queen 9 or jack 10, villain's range has a lot of top pairs. So and when he does have a top pair, we are drawing that. So that's very relevant. So our bluff needs to work a bunch more on the turn. So it's a tougher spot for sure. So we cannot bluff as wide as we would like. So I would just say to bluff draws, like gut shots pretty much in flush draws. And I think that reasoning about protection bet still applies. I do think, although villain has some top pairs, he still has all those hands that he's giving up with, okay, those middling hands that have nothing. So again, betting here with a hand like king deuce or 7-6 or queen 3 suited, I still think it's a good bet on the turn. Again, because I don't think villain is bluffing enough on the turn if we check, and he still has a very large amount of combos that he's folding that have a bunch of equity against those type of hands. And the third reason is, even if we bet king queen 3 and villain calls with top pair with ace X, we still have 5 outs. So it's not as bad as when we bluff with nothing that is drawing that to ace X. When we bluff a pair, usually we have 5 outs to improve, and so our equity is a bit better when villain continues. So there's that. I hope that was clear. But now we have a more interesting thing. Now let's assume that we do check this turn to give up, let's say, and villain checks back again. So it checks twice, flop and turn. And now, what do you guys think? Well, I would say no. It's a very good spot to bluff a very large amount of hands. And my reasoning is, I think that now that villain checked twice, flop and turn, I think that now his ace-x hands that were in this range when he checked back the flop just decreased in probability a lot, because I do think most ace-x either bet the flop or bet the turn. When we check to him again on the turn, he will bet the ace-x that he decided not to bet on the turn, on the flop. So I do think that he gets to this river with a huge amount of air, like king eyes, queen eyes, jack eyes, all sorts of stuff. Of course, he does have some second pairs, but I think that's second pairs and third pairs. A pair, actually. A pair that's not an ace, let's say. So that's possible, but I think that's a small part of his range. So I do think that bluffing here is a very good bluffing spot, because I think we get a very large amount of folds. So if you get here, I don't know, you know what I mean, like let's say you have a hand here like 8-7 or queen 8 or whatever, even king eye is okay, like king 8, king 7, stuff like that. I think it's very good to bluff. I mean, king eyes are a bit closer just because they have a bit of showdown value. So if we have a hand like king 10, I can see an argument for checking on the river, just because river will go check and we will win sometimes. So checking a hand like king 10 on this river is a lot better than checking a hand, let's say 7-5 suited. Let's say we played like that, 7-5 suited. So he has absolutely no showdown value. So if you want to choose between a king high or a 10 high, you should pick the 10 high. 10 high is a much better bluff than king high, just because the EV of the check of the king is a lot higher, and the EV of checking 10 is not that good. So, but yeah, even king high, I think it's okay to bluff. But yeah, bluff a lot. Your range here should be wide. You should be calling a lot pre-flop. You should not be stabbing a bunch on the turn. So you get to this river with a fair amount of very weak holdings. So I think you should be bluffing with the majority of them. And you should be value betting 9x, I think. Like 8-9 or better, 7-9 suited. Yeah, all nines you do get to the river with. I think you should be value betting. Sizing, well, yeah, we definitely don't need a very big sizing, so I think half pot to 2/3 pot should be okay. I wanted to bring your attention to this. This spot is kind of, you should be very aware of the positions that we are talking about. I think it's very different to be talking about this button versus big blind than it is to be talking about big blind versus UTG. Okay, very different. Because both ranges are a lot more tighter. Okay, so on this case, UTG that checks back flop and turn and gets to this river, in his range he does have a lot more of hands like second pairs, like pocket jacks, pocket tens, pocket queens, pocket kings, even some ace-x, weak ace-x suited that he just because of the positions decided to check back twice. So definitely it's very different. On the other hand, our range is a lot more tighter, so we do have a bunch of showdown value with our range, like pocket pairs, and we still have some weak ace-x that gets to the river like this. And then for bluffs we would have some mostly suited broadways. So maybe we should bluff with the worst of those, like jack 10 suited and queen 10 suited, stuff like that. But yeah, not every time. It's a different situation for sure. Okay, let's take another. So let's get back to that example with that 10 high board, okay? So we just went back to the first example. So I told you that in this spot we should be bluffing a fair amount. So let's say we did bluff on the turn, and unfortunately villain called. Of course, that when we bluff on the turn, most of our EV would come when villain folds. So when he calls, it's not so good for us, but we have to deal with it. So now let's think about river. So villain check back the flop and call the turn. So what do you think about river, and what should we do in different rivers with our very weak bluffs? So this is a very interesting and useful game, so to speak. It's very useful for you to think and stuff like this, because it helps you assigning villain a range and trying to figure out what cards help that range and what cards doesn't, and what cards help your range and what cards doesn't. So what do you think are the worst cards for us to bluff the river? What's the definitely the worst, very worst card? I think it's an ace. I think an ace, it's the worst. Okay, I'm gonna put it like this. An ace, I think it's definitely the worst out that you could see on the river, and I definitely think you should be giving up on an ace. And the reason is very simple. I do think that most of villains check back flop call turn range has a bunch of aces, like ace king, ace queen, ace jack, and of course ace 6, ace deuce, ace 3, ace 4, ace 5. All those hands he will play in this fashion. So I do think an ace, it's not that hot for us to be bluffing on the river, although it's a scare card, so to speak. So you have to be very careful with that scare card concept, and you have to think about what it really means. A 10 is not a good card for us, but it's definitely better than an ace, because I should think that villains, let's put it like this. I don't think villain has ever a 10x. I think his range has a very, very few 10x hands that checks back the flop and calls the turn. It's possible that it checks back a hand like 10-4 or 10-5 suited or whatever. Some players do that. I think most of them see bet the flop, and I think they should. So I don't think he has a lot of 10. So pairing the 10, it's not bad, because it helps villain's range, or it's not because he has a lot of 10s or he has a lot of 6s. I do think that pairing the 10 gets villain will call you, he will call you more with a size. I think that's my main point. I think pairing the 10, he will not think that you're repping more thinly, because since the 10 paired, you are now repping fewer combinations of top pair, right? Because if another 10 comes up, less likely you have a 10 in your hand. So you are repping thinner for value. So I think he will hero call you more. And yeah, he has although he might call you anyway with any pair on even on the best river. I do think that pairing the 10, he will call you more happily with a 6, a 3, or a deuce, or even an ace. So 10, not so hot. And 4 and a 5, well, a 4 and a 5 are definitely, if a 4 and a 5 came on the river, you don't rep many straights, and button should have more straights than you, just because you called pre-flop, he opens on the button, you call in the big blind, so he has more low cards combinations than you. So let's say river is a 4, so button has more 5s than you, okay? Button should have hands like, I don't know, king 5 off and queen 5 off and jack 5 off. He might have those, and you don't. So he definitely has more straights in his range than you, and he might check back to give up on the flop and call the turn with a gut shot or whatever. He might do that. So 4 or 5, definitely not the best cards. And I think anything else is a fair game for you to bluff. I do think that. Yeah, pairing the board is not great also, like pairing the 6, pairing the deuce, or pairing the 3. Not great, but I still think Uh, they are okay to bluff. You don't have to, but they are okay. But a card like, let's say, a king. What do you think about a king? I think a king is great for us to bluff. I think that villain does not have a lot of kings in his range. Okay, that checks back flop calls turn. He will not have hands like king queen, king jack, king nine, king eight. He doesn't have those hands, and we do in our range. He might have ace king and then some king six or king deuce or whatever, but yeah, not a lot. A spade. A spade is actually a good card for us to bluff because I think that most villains are not checking back flop with flush draws, so it does not have a flush. So I think betting on a spade is pretty good. Um, and what else? Yeah, an 8 is okay, a 7 is okay. I think, again, he will not check back the flop with a lot of hands like 7, 8, 9, 8, stuff like that, so he does not hit a lot of straights on the river in those cards, so bluffing that should be okay as well. So I just made a small discussion here on what cards we should be bluffing, what cards we should not, and I hope this was useful. So to summarize, I would be bluffing like in very good cards like a king, a queen, a jack, a 9 and a 7, a 9 and 8 and a 7. I think I would still bluff those, and then maybe give up on a 10, on an ace for sure, maybe then on a 10, on a 4, on a 5, and maybe on a 6, on a deuce, or on a 3. I think that should be a decent game plan. I think. I'm not talking about our range and what hands, if we want to bluff every time or not, because of course there are a lot of situations where we should be giving up with some hands and bluffing with other hands, and yeah, I might as well bring it up right now. So whenever you think that you are not so sure this is a spot where you should be bluffing a lot or not, so let's say a 3 comes on the river. So not the greatest card, not the worst. So you're not sure you should be bluffing a lot here or not. So maybe we should try to make a compromise and bluff with some hands and give up others. That should be a more balanced approach. Not perfect, but a bit more balanced. So, and how should we go about our hands? A good way to do it is the blocker talk is a lot complicated. Is fairly complicated and not that important, I think, in this type of situation. So maybe a simpler reasoning should be you should be the worse the showdown value is of your hand, the more you should be inclined to bluff. So let's say you have here the river is a 3 and you have a hand like king jack or king 9. I think that hand is okay to check just because it has a tiny bit amount of showdown value. It's not unreasonable to think that when you check, villain will check back some of the time a worse hand and you win at showdown. That could happen if you hold king eye, but that is definitely not happening if you have 9 high or 8 high. Okay, so the EV of a check with a hand like king eye is a lot bigger than the EV of a check with a hand like an 8, because if you check an 8 you're always losing pretty much, but if you check a king you're not losing every time. That is very relevant. So if you want to bluff, start by bluffing the worst showdown value you have and then climb up and okay, so the hands you have a bit tiny amount of showdown value. I hope that was clear. So let's move on. Another spot, let's say cutoff regular opens 3 big blinds on the cutoff and the button unknown calls on the button, and we decide to overcall on the big blind with a hand like 9-10 suited. The flop is king 8 deuce, you decide to check, the pre-FR decides to check, and the button checks back. The turn comes, you are still check folding. Bluffing here would be not very good in my opinion. So, and the turn goes check 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 again, and now on the river you have a decision to make, and now it's another blankish card. So what do you think about our options? So yeah, because of the nature of this this video, you already realized what I mean, I think. So I think we should be bluffing a bunch here. especially with no showdown value. I think villains are giving up a fair amount. I think PFR. I think both players have very weak holdings, and most of them are folding to a bet on the river, like ace highs, queen highs, jack highs, a lot of broadways that missed, some very weakish pocket pairs. I do think that in this stakes, if you bet here on the river to third spot, I do think both cutoff and button will fold hands like ace deuce, ace three, pocket fours. I do think that will happen. I don't think it's unreasonable to think that way, but still, they will fold a lot of ace highs, a lot of queen highs, and that's pretty good for you. And they do not hold any strong holding, so they do not have top pairs. They only have very weak bluff catchers. So I do think bluffing here is a very wise decision in my opinion, and I think a lot of you guys pass up these spots. And I think that if you think a bit, you try to remember, you will remember a lot of situations when this type of situations where it goes check 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 check, and you lose against ace highs and queen highs and pocket fours and stuff like that, and you should be realizing that you missed a good bluffing situation. So yeah, again, if you have some, I put here a hand like 9-10 suited, but if you hold yourself pocket fours, then bluffing the river becomes a bit closer, a lot closer actually, because you do hold some showdown value, and the check is not as bad as a check with 9-10, because when you hold pocket fours, it goes check 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 and you win some of the time. So I definitely think pocket fours should be a check on the river, but a hand without showdown value, I think you should be bluffing. Ace highs, well, they are close, of course. Yeah, if you hold here ace jack or whatever, it's close. I mean, villains will have to fold pairs for you to properly bluff a hand like ace jack, and some do, some don't. I think mostly do, so I don't hate a bet here with ace jack, although a check might be a more correct decision. But yeah, but hands without showdown value, if you bluff hands without showdown value, so worse than ace highs, I think you are doing an improvement. Let's see another spot. So now let's say pre-flop cutoff opens 3 big blinds, and now you are on the button. Hero is on the button and decides to call with jack 10 suited, quite standard, and the big blind unknown calls on the big blind. So we see a flop and big blind checks, and the PFR decides to check. Okay, so to spice things up a bit, I put here 3 different flops. So, and I think you should be betting in all of them. So I think we should be betting all of them. What is my reasoning? Well, point number 1, cutoff, I mean, the PFR is check folding close to 100% of the time in these stakes. Like that, I think that's quite clear to me. Cutoff is playing very honest in this type of situations where he's facing 2 players, and he will definitely play very straightforward, so he will be check folding a lot. And then you have the value of position. And the thing is, so when you bet here, you are pretty much trying to make big blind fold, because cutoff is folding anyway. But big blind has a problem. Big blind, you're betting into 2 players, and they tend to give you credit for that, and big blind still has cutoff to speak after, okay, to act after him. So he cannot float you very wide. So I mean, if you bet on flop number 1, the top one, big blind is having trouble calling you with ace jack or ace 10. It's not that easy. You're not heads up. It's not that easy for him to float and call you like that, because cutoff is still in the pot, and he is afraid that he might have some sort of hand. So big blind is also forced to play honest. So what ends up happening is that you take down a pot very often, very often. So don't pass up this type of situations. this type of multi-way pots in position where the PFR checks to you, you should be stabbing a lot. Maybe not when you are pretty much dead, but I mean, it's very hard to be drawing that. So maybe don't bluff as much on ace high boards, just because I think uh, ace high boards are ones that the PFR is check folding the least. Okay, I think ace high boards are not as good to be stabbing in position, just because I think PFR is tends to check call a fair amount of top pairs with a weak kicker, and in those situations your bluffs are drawing pretty much dead. So I do think you should be playing a bit more carefully on ace high boards, and and delay your bluffs to later streets, especially on the river, because by then, if villain continues to check, it's very unlikely that he holds an ace, and now it's a very good spot for you to bluff, but not on the flop when they at flop or turn, when they tend to check call a bunch of ace highs, a bunch of weak ace X. So I hope that was clear. So, summary for this episode. There's definitely a lot of dead money in pots that no one wants, and they are literally just waiting for someone to bet and take down the pot, especially in multi-way. In the majority of situations, when a regular checks to you as the PFR, his range is very weak and he will be giving up a lot more than he should. And this is true in position and out of position. And this is even more true if he checks more than once. So if he checks flop, it's weak. If he checks flop and turn, it's very weak. So you should be looking for bluffing a lot, especially with hands without showdown value. And it doesn't matter if you are unbalanced or whatever. It doesn't really matter. He's folding a lot. You're exploiting that leak they have. Whenever you are not certain that the spot is a very clear bluff a lot situation, and, with a lot of profit, at least try to bluff some hands. When you are not sure, try to bluff some hands and go at it by showdown value. What I mean by this is bluff with the hands with the least showdown value, and check hands that win sometimes when you check at showdown. Okay. Thinking about villain's range and what hands are good for you to stab, especially when they open button and you call in the big blind and they check behind on the flop, you should be very careful choosing the hands you are bluffing in and in what cards you should be bluffing. Okay, that's very important, and that gives you some practice regarding interaction between ranges and boards, which is a very, very important concept in poker, and it will open the way for you to think in more advanced situations and level up your game. Okay, so this is Double Two for Poker Strategy. I hope you see you next time. Goodbye.